Hi, Bijo.
Sir, good evening.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir.
Sir, നേരത്തെ കയറിയല്ലേ? Sir, നേരത്തെ കയറിയല്ലേ?
നേരത്തെ ഇപ്പോ just now, 5 minutes back.
Okay, fine. Johnson sir, are you there? Johnson sir?
ഞാനുണ്ട് sir. ഞാനുണ്ട്. I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. Yeah.
How long can I go, Johnson?
So you can have 1 hour or even 1 hour 15 minutes.
Okay. Sure.
Maybe we'll have some questions from the participants.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to wind up in 1 hour. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Jayaram sir, camera ശകലം കൂടെ താഴ്ത്തി വെക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ സാറേ? കുറച്ചുകൂടെ. Yes, correct. Thank you, sir.
It's okay?
Yeah, it's fine, sir. Now it's fine.
Thank you. Audible ആണല്ലോ അല്ലേ?
അതെ.
Audible sir.
സാറ് കുറച്ച് ചെറുപ്പമായതുപോലെ കേട്ടോ. സാറ് കുറച്ച് ചെറുപ്പമായതുപോലെ.
It's second childhood. A trajectory.
Yeah, second childhood. Of course, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
John sir, I think 75 people have already joined.
നമുക്ക് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്താലോ ജോൺസൺ? Hi, Thomas.
Sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
All the way. Hope you are fine. Recovered
Yeah.
completely. Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Yes, I'm here. All the best.
Thomas.
Yeah. Johnson, all the best. I'm here. Many of our faculty are here, actually, and students. All right.
So let's begin. So good evening to one and all. I'm very happy to welcome each one of you to this third session of the orientation program for the MA students. And I'm extremely delighted to introduce and welcome Professor C.S. Jayaram, who is our resource person. Professor C.S. Jayaram retired from the Faculty of English of Sacred Heart College, Tevra. He was our head of the department. And he retired in 2004. And after his retirement, he joined Amrita Institute of Arts and Sciences. And he has been serving there as the Faculty of Visual Communications and of MA English Language and Literature. I know that he doesn't require a formal introduction because he is one of the distinguished teachers of, I would say, of the state. Professor Jayaram is not only a very scholarly faculty, he is a well-known artist. What makes him distinct from other practicing artists is that he is also a theoretician of arts. He's a very famous painter. He's a sculptor. He is an actor. He's a choreographer. He's a playwright. He's a violinist. And he is a multifaceted personality. And he has been a resource person to various academic staff colleges and almost all the arts and science colleges in Kerala. And he also has been participating in other international seminars. And above all, he's a very good human being. And anyone who knows him, who has contacted him, must know that he is such a nice human being. And on behalf of everyone present here, I welcome Professor C.S. Jayaram for this lecture. I also welcome all the participants. I find there are many faculty members from other institutions and many MA students who have just joined and who have completed the MA program from our institution as well as from other institutions. I welcome everyone and wish you a very pleasant evening and a very fruitful academic session. Jayaram sir, please.
Thank you, Johnson. Thank you so much for your kind words about me, and good evening to all of you. In fact, it's a kind of all students get together, because I find so many of our old students here. Though I can't see all of them personally. I hope this presentation may be of some use to you, and I won't be authoritatively, putting anything for your erudition. No, not at all. I'm actually sharing some of my own thoughts and my own misgivings and my own perceptions, and I hope you may contribute to this discussion and enrich me in my field of studies. Now, I think mostly it's PowerPoint presentations, and I am actually handicapped because of Google Meet restrictions. I can't show any videos because what I'm going to speak about, I have amazing videos in my collection, but I am actually handicapped. And I will share a few slides and a few insights about some of the points I want to make. And let me. Can you see it now? The slides?
No, sir. No, sir.
No,
No.
you can't. You can't.
No.
Okay. Let me check it once again. What about this now?
Yes, sir. I think, yeah. I can see your screen now, but not the slides.
It's a slide.
Not the slides?
Yeah.
I can see the browser that you're using, but I can't see the slides.
What about now? No?
No.
So it is still
Let
the
somebody help
browser
you.
window.
Okay. Let me once again try.
I think we can see your screen now. So if you can try bringing your slides up, maybe we'll be able to see that.
Okay. Should I give the entire screen? Now
You could share the PowerPoint presentation itself, or you could share the entire screen and then maximize the presentation.
I think it's clear now.
No, we are not seeing anything.
No, we could see your screen little while before. Now it's gone.
I think sharing the entire screen is a better option.
Yeah. I think I will do that. Now what about that?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
You can see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. See, the topic given to me is visual arts and literature. And as a student of any discipline, you may have to begin with the most fundamental question: what is literature? What do you mean by literature? I will present it from a layman's point of view. What do you mean by literature, actually?
Sir, 1 second before. Could you? I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you maximize your screen? Could you start slideshow?
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Now.
Yeah.
It's
Great.
clear.
Yeah.
It's clear.
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you, what is your idea about literature? What do you mean by literature? A very simplistic definition of literature may be this: that it's a creative written articulation. It's a written articulation by, when common man speaks about literature, it's written literature they have in mind. So it's written articulation, and it is different from other kinds of writing, say for example journalistic writing, in being that it's creative. Okay, it's creative written articulation. And then the question comes, what is so creative about it? How is creative writing, or how is literature creative? What do you mean by creative? And normally, we may say that literature is distinguished from other forms of writing because of the faculty of imagination. How imagination makes it a different kind of writing, appealing to the fantasy or the marvelous, mixing the real and the marvelous, whatever it be. And then when you speak about what is imagination, what do you mean by imagination? Why is it called imagination? I think it's called imagination mainly because it deals in images. It deals in images. Imagination is a faculty that deals in images. And so the question, what is literature, comes down to: literature is nothing but a discourse of images. And when you say verbal images, abstract concepts and all these things, what I personally feel is that every form of writing, every form of thinking is in terms of images. Without images, you can't think. Without images, there is no language. Without images, there is no literature. Say, for example, I utter the word hope, H-O-P-E, hope. And you may say it's an abstract word, and we may discuss hope. Hope is this, hope is that, like, as an abstract concept. But how do you understand hope? How do you understand the meaning of the word hope? When I utter the word hope, I think all of us conceive in our mind an image of hope. Maybe some experience in our life, maybe the face of a person, maybe the sight of a landscape, maybe a beautiful flower, whatever it be. So the moment I mention hope, the moment I mention despair, or any abstract word for that matter, we understand that word logically in terms of an image that the mind conceives. So all concepts are built on images, verbal images. And it is this concept that makes us, read Derrida, for example, in terms of the figurative language of discourse. Post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida, Lyotard, and others, they never deconstruct creative writing. They never deconstruct art or language or literature, creative literature. They only mimic that. Because I think they argue that any discourse ultimately moves towards a figural language. So the figurality, what constitutes the figurality of any discourse is the amount of images that discourse arouses in our mind. And the question of visual arts and literature, when we come to think of the relationship between the two, I approach this topic in two different sections or stages. One, the shared concepts between visual arts and literature, and two, the shared movements. There's a history of movements that are shared both by visual arts and literature, and how one interacts with the other, and how the borders are traversed or transgressed. And the first point is, what are the concepts that are shared equally by visual arts and literature? And it all comes to our perception of reality, because reality is conceived as something constituted by visuality, and the hegemony of sight in human cognition, or in the growth of human knowledge, has been taken for granted. So much so that we have it has all been coded by society through ages, so much so that we have no difficulty in attributing the quantum of truth to any image that we perceive. In fact, if you think of the difference between the thing and its copy, the thing and its object, or the object and its image, no, it all becomes very complicated in the history of human perception or human epistemology. For example, this first slide I show, and if I ask what this means to you, what can it be? What can it be? Can anyone tell me? What does this mean to you? A circle and a few radiating lines.
It's a source of light.
A source of light, or you can say the sun. And if you say the sun, the source of light and all, now universally this is an accepted meaning of this sign. This is semiotics of this sign. Universally, you ask any child or any person anywhere in the world, he will say the sun or the source of light. But when it comes to the question of actual experience, when I ask you, has anyone seen a sun like that? Has anyone seen the sun like that? Has anyone seen the source of light like this? Then it becomes problematic. Then who says this is the sun? It represents the sun, we can say. And in what stage in human history did this symbol emerge, this sign emerge as the sign of the sun? Now it all leads us to the whole fabricability of human knowledge, how human perception has been constructed through a series of images. So much so that today the images predominate over the world of objects, and that's the theory of Baudrillardian simulacra. Today is a world of simulacra where the originals are missing. Actually, now literature fundamentally deals with images, and these are the shared concepts shared by visual arts and literature. Some of the concepts, important concepts are, tone, the question of tone, then the idea of texture, idea of color, then rhythm, then perspective, then space, very important concept of space, then frame. Maybe in the post-structuralist milieu, we can discuss what the frame means, both in literature and in visual arts. Now, when you speak about the tone, it's applied both to music and to painting, visual arts, and even to literature. And what does the word tone actually mean? When you come to visual arts, you speak about the tone and the tint and the nuances or shades, how the tone articulates the nuances or shades and the overlay of colors one over the other. And in music, of course, the tone represents one particular scale and the register of that scale, that musical scale. And in literature, we know tone, the tone of a play, the tone of a writing, the tone of a poem. When we analyze a poem, we speak about the tone of a poem. We speak about the emotional nuances. We read that poem, we enjoy a piece of writing, getting into the emotional tones and even overtones. Say, for example, when we speak about montage, there is tonal montage, there is overtonal montage. And later we will take up that theory, regarding tone. If you think of Bharada's Natyashastra and the Rasa Siddhanta, the sutra that he formulated for Rasa theory, that is Vibhava, Anubhava, and Vyabhijari Samyogad Rasa Nishpatti. So the tone refers to the tonal and overtonal, refers to the Vibhava, Anubhava, especially the Vyabhijari bhavas, the subtle nuances of emotions and feelings that can be captured in color, in musical notes, and in words. And texture is slightly complicated. We can speak about the texture of a painting. For example, as a painter, if you start painting a piece of rock and a piece of silk, a piece of cloth that is silk, and how do you capture the feel? The shape, you can capture the shape or the contours of that object you can capture. But then, what is the rockiness of the rock, or what is the silkiness of the silk? That speaks to you about the texture of objects. Now, in texture in painting, you can use watercolor thin washes, very transparent washes, translucent washes, or you can use oil paint or acrylic paint in thick textures. So there can be thick applications where you can touch and feel the texture of the paint. Then there is a texture of the canvas. If it is on a piece of paper, the texture is different. If it's on a piece of wood wooden panel, then again the texture is different. But in literature, how do you think of texture? How do you analyze texture? For example, look at this sample of a narrative texture. Imagine, for example, in a novel, there are different trajectories of stories, different narratives. For example, first there is a story of A and B. Now B should be here, A and B. That is, the blue lines go as a narrative graph of A and B, the story of A and B. And it's a straightforward chronological narrative, of course, with its ups and downs, that is very rhythmic. And added to that, we have the story of C and D. CD. The story goes like this. And these two are different stories, different narratives. But in the course of the novel, in the course of the fictive narration, these worlds cross each other. They meet at certain point, they converge at certain point, and they diverge. The graph goes like that. Again, added to this, there is a third level of narrative when we are added, that is EF. That is another narrative. So there are three narratives woven so close together. They meet at certain points, then they diverge at certain points. They create a very thick texture. And this is actually multiple narrative, and we have several examples of brilliant multiple perspectives or perspectival stories where different stories converge, different stories coalesce into one another, merge and then diverge and go differently, and finally they meet at certain point. Can you think of any novelist, any novel that adopts this kind of structure, textured layers of narrative? Can anyone? We have, William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying. One example. It's a stream of consciousness novel. It's a story of a funeral, actually. A father, a person carries the dead body of his wife for burial, accompanied by his sons, 2 or 3 sons. And as the coffin is being taken, as they travel towards the funeral destination, the thoughts of each person about the dead woman. The husband thinks of his wife in a particular way. That forms one narrative, the relationship between the husband and the wife. The eldest son thinks of his mother in a particular way, and he rewinds the whole, relative, whole story, whole confrontations, and of course, he had with his mother, and all the differences of opinion, all the quarrels with his mother, and he is so penitent that the mother is gone now. And that makes one narrative, second narrative. And then another son thinks of the mother. Maybe his memories of his mother are different from the memories of the eldest son. So here are a few characters whose main preoccupation is the memories, reviving or reliving the memories with the dead person. So the heroine of the novel is the woman who is dead, who is absent. She is very much present in the reminiscences of the different characters. As I Lay Dying, so she is a heroine, and the different narratives form. All these narratives, though they are different, though their attitude to the mother, though their experiences with that woman are different, they meet at certain points, then they diverge, and the whole texture is so thick, so dense, and it makes a wonderful, stream of consciousness reading As I Lay Dying. We have then Faulkner's Sound and Fury. In Sound and Fury, we have different perspectives, and the whole novel is woven as a blend of different perspectives. Now, this is one way of creating textures. It can be a simple, trajectory, chronological, with a neat graph going up and down. If you remember the Freytag diagram of Shakespearean tragedies, exposition, then development, then climax, then denouement, then anticlimax, or catastrophe, like that. It's a straightforward. It's a very, very straight narrative, linear, chronological narrative, though pyramidal in its structure. But it can get complicated, and this is one way textiles become a shared concept with visual arts and literature. Now we come to space, another vast area, realm in visual arts and also in literature, the treatment of space, the conception of how you conceive space and how space figures in both visual arts and narrative. In visual arts, what do you mean by space actually? How do you experience space? How can we define space in terms of everyday experience? No, simply put, we can say that space is we measure space, or we understand space as a distance between two objects. We see one object very close to us and another object so far away from us. So we perceive some kind of distance between these two objects, and they actually predicate a kind of space. They constitute a kind of, they create a kind of sense of space within us. And this experience of space, this is how we experience space. And in visual arts, space is divided into two categories called figure and ground. That is positive and negative spaces. So for example, you can't think of a figure without a background. Can you conceive of a figure? Can you think of a figure, any image or a figure or an object without a background? So our perception of an object goes along with the perception of the background in which that figure operates. And in literature, we call it the context. Without a context, you can't think of a text. Any image has a concomitant context, and our perception, our understanding, our experience is, in that sense, total. We consume both the positive and negative space, that is the figure, and the ground as a whole, and human perception traditionally has divided these two into two compartments, figure and ground. I will show you another picture. You look at this picture. This is a drawing by Escher, Maurice Escher, a French artist, called Mosaic 2. What do you see in this picture? Of course, there are figures. And if there is a figure, there must be a background also. What kind of figure you perceive? Is it black and white figures in white background? Can anyone reciprocate? Can you? What do you see actually? We have black figures, black and white figures like this, but you think of the empty spaces. All these empty spaces are figures in their own turn. So once we focus on the black as figure, the white becomes a background. But there is a chance of our shifting our focus onto the background, then the white becomes a figure and the black becomes a background. So Escher was actually playing upon this fallacy of human perception, this dichotomy of human perception into figure and ground. It's all a fallacy. It's all a feeling. Everything merges into a totality, and the reality of human perception is a total consumption, is a simultaneous consumption of both the figure and the background. I'll show you another picture. Can anyone read this?
Mailbox.
Mailbox, exactly. But there is not a single letter in the English alphabet used here. The images are meaningless images. All the black objects are meaningless, but the way they are arranged, the way they are composed so tightly, the space between them forms an idea of a letter. Now, these four images together trap an empty space within that is a negative space within that. It becomes a letter, it becomes a figure. And here, again, figure, which is actually negative space. So there is a way of perceiving the background as the figure. There is a way of foregrounding the background in a way, confusing our whole perception of what is foreground, what is background, what is figure, what is background and all. So here, what I mean is that there is a particular composition. It is a particular spacing that allocates certain meaning to these meaningless objects that some of you have read it. It can be read as mailbox. Or if you shift the focus, it can be read as an arrangement, an array of meaningless black colored objects. Now, another division of space is into deep space and shallow space. When you speak about space, it can be very deep. You can even feel the depth of that space here. You know, two railway lines, two tracks going never-endingly and finally converging at a certain point. We know these parallel lines never meet in reality, but your eyes tell you they meet at certain point. Now, if you can capture this point and reconstruct your whole vision in terms of this non-existent point, this fallacious point, then the whole space becomes meaningful for you. The whole space becomes very real, very perceivable. Now, this kind of space is called deep space. And what about the space here? There is not this from a movie, just a still from a movie, an amazing psychological shot. Now here, all the entire background is blurred. It is just a flat cutout figure, two-dimensional, and the entire focus is on the face only. Now, this man, we know that there is vast space behind him. We know the whole thing is in real space, but that's not what we see actually. Now, this kind of spacing is called flat space, where you use, for example, in the use of close-ups, very often we resort to flat space, and flat space can often be used very effectively for certain emotional stages, certain emotional expressions, especially in cinema. Now, in literature, when you think of deep space and flat space, that takes us to the idea of perspective, one key point in literature and visual arts: perspective. In literature, what do we mean by perspective? Another word for perspective can be angle of vision, point of view. For example, if you remember Henry James, it can be point of view, or it can be angle of vision. But the idea of perspective originated in visual arts during Renaissance, Western Renaissance. The artists were also mathematicians and geometricians. Now they began to think about articulating real space in painting, in visual arts. Till then, space in visual arts was conceptual, was virtual, not visually realistic. Now, in their pursuit to find some means of articulating real space into two-dimensional canvas or paper, they stumbled upon the invention of perspective. Now they realize what is the human experience of space. You see an object walking towards you any person or any animal or any object that moves towards you becomes bigger and bigger in our sight. And the same object, if it retraces its steps, moves backward, it diminishes, gradually diminishes in size. Ultimately, it becomes a spot and then disappears from our vision. Now we know the object doesn't change. An elephant walking towards you becomes so bigger and it fills the whole field of vision. The same elephant, we know, a huge animal, walking away from you, at certain point it can even vanish into thin air. It can become a dot and it can vanish into thin air. Now this phenomenon is an illusory perception of reality they discovered. But in order to understand, in order to articulate this real space, it is necessary to accept this visual fallacy, this fallacious or faulty visual experience. And they believe that point in the distant horizon towards which all the parallel lines in our vision converge, that point doesn't exist because we know parallel lines don't converge, as I show you in the slide of the railway tracks. Now that point is called vanishing point. It is called a vanishing point because the moment you walk towards it, it recedes. You can never touch it. It forever recedes forever into the background. You can never touch it because it's a non-existent point. It's a transcendental point. It's a metaphysical point. And that point is very much necessary for you to construct your sense of reality in visual arts. And based on that point, vanishing point, non-existent central vanishing point, the whole human experience of space has been constructed in visual arts. Now, this is the theory of perspective. For example, here, look at this picture of a Renaissance gallery. No, the space, it's a deep space. The depth of the space you can measure because the whole recedes into distant background. And all the parallel lines, these are parallel lines. They finally converge at a certain point, the distant point, the distant horizon. It's a non-existent point, but they seem to converge to that point. Now, it is this point, transcendental point, that is very central to our idea of reality and also realism in visual arts and literature. So, for example, this painting, this photograph may remind you of the lines from Tennyson, say Ulysses. Each experience is an arch. Each experience is an arch through which gleams the light of eternity. And Tennyson and his mariners, fellow mariners, they go in search of that light of eternity, but they know they can never touch it. They can never. It's a hypothetical point. It's a transcendental point, beckoning man forever and ever into a kind of transcendental, interminable journey. Because that point is very seductive as a will-o-the-wisp. But that point centralizes and it grounds our perception of reality in this way. And again, you take, perspective can be a single point of view, single perspective, then double perspective, then multiple perspectives. And the use of multiple perspectives in visual arts like this, this building is in single point perspective, there is only one vanishing point. The same building in a different perspective, it has two vanishing points, one converging top, the other converging on this side, on the right side. And here this building has three vanishing points. One vanishing point converging right, other on the one on the right and other on the left, and one on top. 3 point, multiple perspectives. Now, if you think of these multiple perspectives in the use of literature, I want to remind you of your Henry James or Jamesian theory of point of view. And it was Henry James who formulated the theory of point of view. He spoke about authorial point of view, spoke about that is single point of view, then multiple points of view. Now, when you think of certain novels, for example, say Huckleberry Finn, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn, that story is unraveled through one single perspective, that is that of Huckleberry. Now, he's a pariah boy, he's an orphan. And so the narrative, what he sees, may have its own limitations, but may be very dramatic, very concrete, because it is based on his experience of the world. Again, we have Moby Dick, a brilliant single point perspectival narrative, that of Ishmael. Call me Ishmael, that's how the novel begins. And the entire experience, entire adventure of whale hunting is unraveled through the eyes of that single character, that is Ishmael. Now, this becomes literature, writing, fiction becomes so dramatic with the use of this kind of multiple perspectives or single perspective. And I told you about William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, Sound and Fury earlier. And he's an example. These novels are examples of using multiple perspectives or multiple points. The texture becomes very thick. Earlier, if you think of novels of Dickens, novels of Thackeray, Trollope, Henry James himself says there were huge fluid puddings into which anything can be put. It can be an authorial point of view, and the author sees everything, is omniscient, and traditional narratives are in omniscient points of view. But the moment the writer or the poet starts using single point of view or dramatic point of view, the whole thing becomes dramatic. And in fact, it is this dramatic quality that we find in Browning's dramatic monologues. Browning's dramatic monologues. We call them monologues because there is only one speaker, but monologue because that speaker is speaking to somebody else who is mute throughout the poem. But what's so dramatic about it? What is so dramatic about it? Because it is dramatic because it's perspectival. It is single point perspective that Browning offers. Now, for example, My Last Duchess. It is a duke's perspective that you get in the poem. In that way, we are so constrained to accepting only the duke's point of view. But the interesting thing about perspective is that when you show something in perspective, it gives you an additional information than the reality about that object or that. For example, look at this building. This building shows you its three perspectives. The towering height of this skyscraper, it gives you some idea about this building. That's the primary object of the photographer, to capture the towering height of this building. But because it is perspectival, it gives you an additional information that the photographer maybe did not think of divulging to you. What is that additional information? What is that plenitude of information that you experience in this perspectival photograph? An additional information which the photographer basically did not want to divulge to you, to disclose to you. You get that. So you are actually privileged over the creator, the photographer or the painter. What is that additional information? You come to know where exactly the photographer must have stood to capture this building in this form, three-point perspectival form. He must have stood somewhere in the corner of that building. He must have stood outside the building, and only then he must have looked at this building from a low angle point of view. Only then he was able to capture. Only then he could be able to capture this building in this. So the position of the photographer, the position of the artist, the viewer gets, and that was not the primary objective of the photographer of the artist. It's an additional knowledge that the viewer gets. You take, and that's very dramatic. This makes it very dramatic. If you take My Last Duchess, if you take Porphyria's Lover, or Fra Lippo Lippi, any of the dramatic monologues of Browning, the information that the speaker gives you, we get additional information. Sorry, that's the primary information you get, the summary of the point. But then additionally, without the knowledge of the speaker discloses his own perspective, his own standpoint, his own limitations, his own character. In reading my last lectures, we get an idea of what exactly, what kind of person the Duke was exactly, more than the image of the Duchess. Now, he makes some kind of slips in his description of the Duchess. So this quality of perspectival rendering makes Browning's dramatic monologues very dramatic. And in literature, especially in fiction and also in drama, it's nothing but the brilliant use of perspectives and the crisscross of perspectives. Various perspectives clash with each other to create a kind of network of gazes and all these things. Ultimately, in the modern theory, perspectives bring us to a theory of the gaze. Whose gaze is riveted on whom? And what's the whole quality of that? And how does meaning form itself in the mind of the reader or the viewer? And when you think of the color, we have, when you think of color, one basic theory of color is, color can be divided into warm and cool colors. For example, red, orange, yellow are warm colors, family. Then blue, violet, and green are cool colors and all. Now, in writing, in creative writing, we think of color in terms of the emotions. I told you the Sanchari Bhavas, the nuances of emotions that can be captured in words, captured verbally. Now, these emotions constitute, the feeling of the color, for example. And apart from the fact that most writers use color imagery brilliantly, we have writers who resort to certain colors very powerfully, and color imagery can be analyzed in any text. The use of color becomes very important. I will speak to you about color very soon when we come to literary movements and visual art movements. And then we have primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. The third level colors, primary, then secondary color. And when you mix primary and secondary, we get a third level color, tertiary color, which takes us again to the transitory moods or Sanchari Bhavas in literature. What kind of writing can capture the transitory, evanescent, fleeting feelings and emotions? For example, when you think of Andre Gide, or when you think of Thomas Mann, or when you think of other Impressionist writers, how very subtle passing moods are captured through words, and it all boils down to the sense of the sense of colors, coloring experience. And in fact, color, the word color in our language is varna. And in music also we speak about color. In music also we speak about varna. And both these ideas, varna in music and varna in visual arts, they coalesce to form a kind of very thick knowledge, very, very dense knowledge of color in literature. Now, these are some of the concepts that we can think of as being shared by both visual arts and literature. And when we come to shared movements, the second phase of my talk will be about movements that are shared by both visual arts and literature. Now, here are a few of the important movements, mostly dealing with modernism. We have Impressionism, we have Expressionism, then Cubism, Surrealism, and Dadaism. Now, when you come to Impressionism, this was the painting that inaugurated Impressionist movement and earned the name its name, that is Impressionism, the painting by Claude Monet, Impression Sunrise. Now, Impression Sunrise, what you find, I don't go into the historicity of that movement, we don't have time, But what the painter has captured here is the sunlight. Though the title is Impression Sunrise, actually, literally, the theme itself is the sunlight. And Impressionism, the very definition of Impressionism is, the subjective rendering of an objective reality. Reality is outside, that is objective. There is a seascape, there is a sea, there is a sky, there is a sun, and the buildings and the ships and all, with their mass and all, and the small canoe here. And these objects, or this objective reality, is not captured in the traditional manner, is not articulated in the traditional style, but is perceived highly subjectively and is rendered highly subjectively. So how did the artist saw that particular scene at a particular moment in life? That was the subject of the painting. Not the sunrise in itself, not the morning in itself, but how the artist perceived the sunrise, impression sunrise. Maybe as another person may perceive the sunrise in a different way, see it in a different way. But here the attempt of the artist is to articulate his impression or his emotions when he at the time of watching this sunrise. So here, this is a very seminal moment in the history of literature, in the history of visual arts and literature. Now, this was the moment that marked the shift of mimetic theory, the shift of art and literature from mimesis to what you call emotions, expression of expressive theory. The mimetic theory, art is a reflection of reality, and it reflects its duties to reflect reality as in a mirror. The essential Aristotelian theory and all these things, mimetic theory. Now, at this point in the late 1890s, that's the end of 19th century, a very crucial paradigmatic shift took place in visual arts and literature, that the business of the artist or the writer is not to render reality as such mirror-like, not to imitate reality or mimic reality objectively, which is impossible. They found it impossible, but to go back into their own inner psyche and see how they perceived it, or what was the feeling of perceiving that, the feeling of perception, actually, or what was in their mind when we saw, when they saw that sight, or when they experienced a particular thing. So it becomes a kind of inward journey. Art, the pursuit of art, the pursuit of reality in literature and art becomes an inward journey. More and more, the realism became a kind of psychological realism. It was a moment when fiction also introduced psychological realism, what you call interior monologue or stream of consciousness. Again, brother of Henry James, William James coined that term, in literature. It is exactly, this coincided, the Impressionist moment coincided with the stream of consciousness moment in literature. Both pursued the passing nuances of emotions and feelings created by the response to, the reciprocation to certain external stimuli. It was at this moment that Virginia Woolf spoke about life not as a series of jet lamps symmetrically arranged, but a vast luminous halo enveloping all our being. And Henry James spoke about sensibility or imagination as a huge, immense spider web, catching in its finest silken threads every speck of experience. In fact, when you think of experience itself, experience is something highly subjective. There is nothing objective about experience. Experience, the sum total of experience, is actually a highly subjective perception of what you went through. A whole series of experiences finally consummating in your consolidation of your ego. And Wordsworth had that idea of experience when he spoke about spot of time. Life as a series of spots of time, very important moments in our life, constituting mnemonically what you really are or what the world really is. An experience is nothing but, a kind of a series of images. Experience itself is a kind of, experiencing the world in images and weaving it together. Look at this impressionist painting by Claude Monet. Now, again, sunlight is a theme. Whatever they painted, the theme was sunlight. Because I realized that sunlight, we see the world in sunlight. Our reality, visual reality is constructed by the sunlight. And light is so much important for impressionist painters, as it was important to Virginia Woolf in her novels and to Henry James also. Now here, what you see is there is no objective reality to any of these objects. They are all rendered highly subjectively. And in the subjective pursuit of reality, they realize that color is highly subjective. They realize that there is nothing black. There is no black color in nature. They realize that even shadows have colors. Their discovery that shadows have colors. Every shadow is determined by the color, the primary color of the object that casts the shadow plus its secondary color, creating a kind of tertiary combination, complementary combination, objective opposite color like that. So it is this optical research that enriched the painting, that made the palette so vivid. And if you transpose this invention, this discovery into literature, again, the passing nuances of expressions I spoke to you about. If you take To the Lighthouse, for example, and To the Lighthouse, the second section, the window, and the second section, Time Passes. There Virginia Woolf describes a building minute by minute, second by second, subjected to the ravages of time. Time enters the building, habitation, through the chinks and through the windows and through fissures, and eats it. How a building is so solid, a thing called building, that house is subjected to the ravages of time. And it's a brilliant poetic piece, and minute by minute she registers that decrepitude in that novel. Now, after writing that, she wrote to her sister, I wrote something. I can't call it a novel. Is it a poem? I'm not sure, because it's highly it's noted for the sheer poetry of the second section, especially Time Passes. Now, if you think of impressionistic writing in that way, as I told you, for this impressionist artist, reality is in the present. It is the present moment that they depict, the present moment that they notice, they articulate. There is no past tense in impressionism, both in painting and in literature. Literary, impressionism uses only the present. Everything is articulated, everything is described in the present. It's a perennial present, eternal present that is articulated in impressionism. Now, this had brilliant impact on cinema. All these things coincided towards the end of the 19th century. Impressionism painting coincided with stream of consciousness, which is also a kind of articulation of the present in the mind of the character, in the subconscious of the or unconscious of the character. It coincided with cinematic, cinematography, the invention of cinematography, and the whole technique of cinema as articulating only the present. Because cinema has no past tense, For whatever past tense the cinema has to show, they have to show it as a flashback, then they're showing it actually. And any showing is in the present. You see the image of the past in the present acting. Wherever the camera is, there is a present. And wherever the visual artist's vision is, that is a present. Wherever the writer looks at or thinks about it, that is a present. So it's the kind of impact of the present that you find in impressionist writing, impressionist painting, as well as in cinema, which is mostly impressionistic. Another painting, it's a brilliant study in sunlight, where there is no permanency for this reality. Next moment, these characters may change. Next moment, her swing may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. Next moment, she may return. Next moment, she may go back. 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 Next moment, the sun's slanting rays may change, direction may change, all the characters may change. So the reality for Impressionist painter is only contingent reality, the reality of this moment. It's not, reality is not something, monolithic outside. No, nothing like that. There is no permanent reality for Impressionism. The whole idea of permanent reality was fragmented into tiny atoms of light. Again, this becomes very significant because it was at this moment that in literature, in philosophy, in literature, the whole idea of self-reflexivity began to figure. Writing became self-reflexive. And self-reflexivity coincided with this idea of fragmented reality that the Impressionist painters introduced. When you come to next movement, that is Expressionism, it succeeded Impressionism. After Impressionism, what you find is the World War comes, First World War comes, and somewhere around 1910, human nature changed, Vajina says. So many things. There was a total change in human perception, human experience. The war changed everything. Every equation was completely changed, subverted by the war. And at that time, coexisting with Impressionism, there was a movement in Germany that was growing up that came to be known as Expressionism. A group of young architects from an architectural institute, they came out taking their degrees, and they formed a group, and they thought that, and they began to practice painting. And they thought that their artistic practice must be towards reforming society, because German society at that time, in the World War eras and the immediately succeeding the post First World War era, it was actually a degenerate society. Values had decayed, and there was total degeneration. And it was a time, Eliot wrote Wasteland, the idea of the world and the reality that people confront that time. And a few artists in Germany began to practice painting with an idea of reforming society, or subjecting that art as a critique of society, as a very live, potent critique of society. And they began with this proselytizing zeal, and this one painting is one example of the distinct vision that Expressionists had. Max Textine, the boats. Now here, if you look at this painting, it is something about reality, a kind of seascape that is saw, but the sky is not real, the sea is not real. There can be no such sky or sea or the boats in reality. The coloring, the rendering of the color is highly subjective. The whole thing is a subjective rendering. Same as Impressionist technique of subjective rendering, but then here, this is subjective rendering where the reality itself has become subjective. There is nothing real about this scene. So Expressionism can be defined in opposition to Impressionism as a subjective rendering of a very subjective reality. So the reality itself is problematized. Whose reality is it anyway? It began with Impressionism, and it climaxed, it was augmented in this period of Expressionism. If you look at this painting, a very celebrated painting by Edvard Munch, The Scream. Now, a skeletal figure, a bare schema of a human figure, crying, screaming, and passing a bridge, running to a bridge, and the whole sky and the river, they are boiling outside, and two persons follow this figure. This was actually autobiographical, and Edvard Munch had a similar experience. He had some psychic problems. He was undergoing therapy. One night he was walking over a bridge. One moonlight night he was walking over a bridge when an uncanny sound, insubstantial sound, began to drum in his ears. It began as very inaudible, then it assumed some volume, and it became very frightening. And Munch, shut his ears, screamed, and ran away from that bridge, ran away from that scene. Two of his friends, he was walking with two of his friends, he ran away and straight away went to his studio and converted the whole experience into a kind of woodcut, black and white woodcut called the screen. Later, he rendered color to that. Now, this is highly a kind of subjective experience. Is a kind of psychological or psychedelic experience that Impressionism, this expressionist painter had, and this actually sums up the whole features of Expressionism. Expressionism is highly subjective movement. The reality is subjective, and the themes, some central themes of Expressionism were, insanity, madness, and then sense of insecurity, then irrationality, then the notion of violence, notion of persecution, notion of the uncanny, nightmarish experience of life. All these things are epitomized in this one single amazing painting called Scream. So much so that the whole expressionist movement acquired a name called the Cosmic Scream. The whole movement was called the Cosmic Scream because what began as a very revolutionary movement later lost its positiveness or lost its energy, and most of the painters became pessimists, realizing that a mere painting or a mere poem cannot change humanity. So this make them turn inwards into their own innermost unconscious and articulate all the angst, the psychic oppressions and psychic anxiety of these writers and artists. And because of this quality of psychic content, quantum of psychological experience, Expressionism became very significant in the modernist period. For example, Beckman, look at this painting, Night, simply Night. The theme is oppression or persecution. A family, husband and wife are persecuted. We don't know the reason, nothing. But the whole scene becomes very oppressive, very claustrophobic, and very suffocating. Then again, Ernest Ludwig Krishna, lovers. The theme is very romantic, lovers, but you see, there is no expression of love on their faces, no sign of love on their faces. Each is suspicious of the other. Now, one constant theme of Expressionism was the incompatibility in man-woman relationship, incompatibility in man-woman relationship. For example, read this passage, Sons and Lovers by Lawrence. Here is a passage where Clara meets Paul Morrell, the hero of this novel. They are physically together, but they are poles apart, they are miles apart. Though Clara was actually hugging him, though they were in intimate moment of intimacy, Clara had a feeling that she was not able to grip him. She was not getting what she wanted. So this anxiety at the height of her excitement, characterizing what you call romantic agony, was another aspect of Expressionist painting. Now, this is a neo-expressionist painting monument for a Vietnam shrine by Gregory Gillespie, articulating violence, the bitter violence of war. It's an anti-war painting, a homage to Vietnam fighters. Now, if you look at Expressionist poem like Godek by George Trakl, if you read, now silently gathers in the grazing lands a red cloud, the dwelling of an angry god ingested with the blood, again red, a cool moon, and under its the roads unto putrid blackness, black again. The color imagery becomes very oppressive in Expressionist writing. A red cloud. For example, we have in Wasteland a red rock. Coming under the shadow of the red rock, I will show you something different from either. I will show you fear in a handful of dust, the poet says. The impact of redness, the importance of redness, red color for Expressionist writers and Expressionist painters. They share this color imaging. Then Expressionist plays. When you come to Expressionist plays, the notion of oppression, notion of persecution, notion of psychic traumas in a style of in a category of Expressionist drama called ick drama. What you call ick drama is the whole theme will revolve around one central character. In fact, the whole theme of the drama is a central psychological exploration of the character, as in Emperor John's. If at all other characters appear, they will only appear as concomitant cutout figures to supplement, make this drama more realistic or more articulate. And then in cinema, in German cinema, Expressionism contributed very much in cinema. For example, what we call chiaroscuro lighting, that is light and shade. In classical writing, in painting, in Renaissance painting, through all these centuries up to Impressionist painting, you don't see light and shade brilliantly used, except in Baroque art. Baroque was only movement in classical period that used light and shade very effectively. And Expressionism resorted to the Baroque use of chiaroscuro or light and shade. And most of the brilliant Expressionist cinema are black and white films that use huge, frightening shadows along with light. More than lighted scenes, Expressionist cinema has the use of chiaroscuro. And even today, the use of chiaroscuro is very important in cinematic lighting. And again, surrealistic settings, fluidity of mobile framing, all these things you can think of. The first important Expressionist movie is Cabinet of Caligari. Then we come to Cubism, another movement called Cubism. Entirely different style from the styles that we were discussing, Impressionism and Expressionism. When you come to Cubism, it's an altogether different grammar. Now, it is called Cubism because the Cubist artists Picasso and Braque, they argued that any object in nature can be reduced to basic geometric shapes. And our reality, the reality of the objective world, is a reality of these different geometric shapes composed. So it is a kind of abstract composition that you take as your reality. And the business of a Cubist painter is to defragment, to fragment this reality into its basic geometric shapes and configure them in a different way. In other words, to compose them in a different way, which constitutes a kind of higher reality. And this was the inaugural painting of Cubism called La Demoiselle d'Avignon, where human figures are seen as geometric shapes. Then again, another brilliant contribution of Cubism was in cancelling the negative space of the background. The whole thing becomes a flat design where figures are not etched out from the background. Figure and the background merge into one total dimension of design into a kind of flat design. Background is cancelled. Again, in the postmodern writing of Claude Simon and others, in all these writings, Nouveau Roman writers, you find Cubism brilliantly used where the background is cancelled in this brilliant way. Another painting by Picasso, Mary Teresa Waldo. Here there is a figure, human figure, but the figure is walked around and configured in different dimensions. The same figure seen through different perspectives. In other words, the aim of Cubism was to approximate sculpture, because in viewing sculpture, you walk around a sculpture to perceive the whole sculpture, the three-dimensionality of the sculpture. And the Cubist painter wanted to capture that three-dimensionality, that completeness in walking around and conquering that. And this is one Cubist writing, Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was a Cubist writer who was associated with Picasso. And one piece of writing goes like this: something had been coming out of him. Certainly it had been coming out of him. Certainly it was something. Certainly it had been coming out of him. It had meaning, charming meaning, solid meaning, etc. She repeats the same thing. What she does in her writing is she takes up one situation and walks around that situation to constitute a kind of reality, solid reality, as a Cubist painter does. Cubism assumes a kind of dramatic concreteness, and it was this that later led to the movement called Imagism, capturing the whole concreteness of an image, the solidity of an image, the whole emotional complex of an instant of time within an image, as Brown said, that came from, it was a spin-off of cubism. For example, this cubist writing, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, very celebrated cubist piece by Gertrude Stein again. Every rose is different, because when you come to the second rose, it is in addition to the memory of the first rose. And third rose is a sum total of the memory of the two roses, and the fourth rose again. Every time you repeat the word rose, there is a accumulation of its impact, accumulation of the image, and the ultimate rose is entirely different from the first rose with which you start. Now, this you can think of in Derridian theory, Derrida's theory of traces, how every reading is characterized by the trace of our experience, the trace of preceding words, the trace of preceding narratives, like that. Now, when you come to last movement, I will finish with this. Surrealism. Surrealism was another modernist movement that influenced literature and cinema very much. And Surrealism was a very seminal movement. Surrealism, the Sir, S-U-R, Sir in Surrealism is superior. Now, Surrealism believed that, as I told you in psychological realism, that the actual reality is the world of the interior, world of the subconscious, world of the unconscious, than the outside world of common sense. Now, Surrealism, they were influenced by Freud, especially Freud's dream analysis, interpretation of dreams. And they believed that the business of an artist is to ferret out the images that lurk within the subconscious of the artist. And the subconscious has a language, and it's a language of analogy. It's a language of metaphor, and it's the same as a language of madness. So for a surrealist, the best way to become a surrealist painter is to somehow explore or excavate the unconscious, and the only way to explore the unconscious is to become consciously mad. The paranoid critical method, as they call it. You must be paranoid, you must be mad, but that madness must be creative. A kind of creative madness can delve into the human unconscious and ferret out the lurking images from within the unconscious. And when you compose these images on a canvas, it will have a higher sense of reality than the actual real world. In other words, for the surrealists, what mattered was the insight and not the sight. The insight was very important for them, and in order to gain this deep insight, they had to cut the sight, they had to block the sight. So, for example, this is a painting by Max Ernst, Oedipus Rex. How Oedipus blinded himself, that blindness becomes a theme in surrealism, because they juxtapose insight with blindness, insight and blindness. Now, here is a nut-like object that is sliced by a hacksaw, and that introduces a theme of blindness that relates this painting to the story of Oedipus. But the whole thing is as in a dream. The whole experience is as in a dream. For example, in this painting by Dali, the Temptation of Saint Anthony, the elephants, look at the legs of elephants and horses, the spiral-like legs. The whole experience is a dream, a hallucinatory dream that occurred to Saint Anthony, and the dreamlike quality is sustained or maintained. In other words, you can say the landscape of a surrealist painting is oniric. Oniric means pertaining to dreams, and this oniric quality characterizes surrealist writing also. When you speak about surrealist writing, very often the related term magical realism comes to our mind. What is so magical about magical realism? Why is magical realism magical? It has definitely something to do with realism, and that realism is a kind of magical realism because the syntax is normal, day-to-day syntax, and using that day-to-day syntax or grammar, you take off at a tangent into the world of the marvelous. using the grammar of day-to-day language, everyday language, you transcend, you cross that barrier of the real, and you enter the world of the marvelous. You jump into, leap into the world of the marvelous. You know what Kafka attained in Metamorphosis. What Coleridge attained in Ancient Mariner. The language is the language of ordinary discourse, but the things that this ordinary language fabricate is a kind of illusory reality, a hallucinatory reality, a dreamlike reality. And the mixing of the real and the marvelous is so brilliant in surrealist writing, and the same thing characterizes in magical realism. It is magical because it gets into the world of the marvelous, but then the language it uses is so normal. For example, when I use the word, a kind of magical object I create, a cross without arms. I make a cross without arms, or you think of the definition of surrealism as the encounter, the magical encounter, the enchanting encounter of a sewing machine and umbrella on a dissection table. It's so magical. Actually, they have no relationship with one another, no relations absolutely. They are so, disparate realities. But when they are put together on a realm entirely alien to them, they interact with each other, they conflict with each other, and create a kind of higher reality. It is this higher reality that surrealists wanted to explore. I think I have to wind up because it's nearing 7:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayaram sir, for that very enlightening and interesting.
I have a shortage of time now. So many things I left unsaid.
I know. You are always at your best when it comes to the relationship between art and literature. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talking about.
Any interaction?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So now if we have some questions or clarifications or even additions, we can do that. The floor is now open for discussion.
Could I ask a question to Jayaram, sir?
Oh, sure. Is it Vimal John?
Yes, sir. It's me, Vimal. Yes.
Okay, Vimal. Ask me.
Thank you, sir. Such a pleasure listening to you as usual. I have so many questions, but keeping everybody's interest in mind, I think I'll limit myself to 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
So what I want to ask you is regarding this idea of these shared visual concepts and epistemology that in some sense you began with.
Okay.
So what about the people who are visually impaired? Because visually impaired, people who are blind.
Excellent question. An excellent question. I remember. Tell me.
Yeah, let me. If I can complete my question, maybe you can answer it all together.
Yeah, sure.
So, if our epistemes are largely based off our shared visual concepts, you mentioned color and perspective and all those things.
Yeah.
So, wouldn't that at least be theoretically tantamount to undermining the nature of reality itself? But for people who do not have the faculty of vision.
Yeah.
Or is point of view something that is connected to the idea of individual subjectivity itself?
Yeah.
But in any case, how do we really engage with the nature of reality?
Yeah, I think it's a very brilliant question and a very difficult question to answer because only a blind man can, one who is impaired with impaired eyesight can answer the question. But I can tell you one thing. I shared a similar experience years back in an international seminar in Hyderabad, where a professor from Rhode Island came and spoke about, his projects. He was actually making so many projects based on this kind of visual perception. When one candidate came for admission for the course, and the candidate, she was physically impaired, her eyesight was impaired. She was blind. And that was the first moment when this professor entirely thought of this problem. He had started out the whole course for, visual arts based on perception and all these things. He had never taken into account the experience of a blind person. And that made the professor think, and he began to think about that. And he says, though I could not entertain that candidate, later, in a few years, in a couple of years, he learned that scientists had invented a kind of chip that could be implanted into your brain that can give you a kind of visual map in the mind. We have some films. We have some films like that. A blind man, a chip is inserted in his brain, and that chip makes him visualize the scene in the mind, only in a graphic form, only in a schematic form. But I'm not I don't want to dwell on that. This is an interesting question, but for me, how does a blind person perceive the world without eyesight as we have is a very interesting question, because mostly they perceive the world through sound. They have very keen, sharp sense of sound and sharp sense of tactile experience. They perceive the world through touch and through sound. If you have a blind person as your friend, the moment you enter the room, she or he can tell you who you are. They have very, very highly sophisticated sense of sound. Their auditory faculty, their tactile faculty are so developed, so advanced. In fact, I would say we are at a disadvantage in perceiving the world. They, the blind person, perceive the world in a more concrete, solid manner. They touch it, they feel it, they hear it. For example, but for us, we are guided by, or we are controlled by the hegemony of sight, visual sight, so much so that other faculties are dwindling. Other faculties are. This was a major problem with perspective. Even during Renaissance time, writers had this problem. Reality is not mere visual reality. In fact, you take Shakespearean tragedy. The whole dominant, persistent theme in Shakespearean tragedy is the hiatus, the gulf between what you see and what is really. You can smile and yet be a villain. Look like the innocent flower and be a serpent under it. When Othello was told by Iago that his wife is unfaithful, he wanted to see with his eyes, but he failed to apply his auditory faculty. If he had, he would have come to know that Portia was talking to Cassio about something else. It was not an amorous encounter. But he prioritized his eyesight, and that was a tragedy. And in the scene of killing, he had to say, put out the light and then put out the light. And that is why surrealists believed in slicing the eyeballs. You shut the eyesight to get a real insight. They went inside. And I think a blind person, by virtue of being blind, is gifted with that palpable, concrete idea of the world than people endowed with eyesight. And I don't know whether you would believe, but I have a cousin who's one of her friends is a blind woman. She says that this blind friend can even sense the color of the blouse or the dress that this cousin wears. It's amazing. I don't know how she manages that. They were concrete. And if you have read often Pamuk, My Name is Red, Pamuk describes the practice in the Persian, ateliers by miniature painters. When they attain mastery in miniature painting, these masters, they slice their eyesight. They take a needle and pierce the retina. They become willingly blind. And their excuse is they don't want to be polluted by external reality, which they see as a kind of illusion. It's all a question of reversing what is real, what is illusion. And surrealists were playing with that. And I think it's a brilliant question, because the whole discourse is becoming visual. What characterizes postmodernism from modernism is that visuality is very much in the field, is foregrounded into all discourses. When I speak about the figurality, modernism is characterized, obsessed by time, Buxtonian time. It is temporal concerns that characterize modernism. Whereas for postmodernism and post-structural theories, it is a space that matters. And your question, is a brilliant question. But what I can tell you is that we measure space not only with eyes, but with the auditory faculty and with our tactile faculty. For example, when you are driving a car, you are very much conscious of the vehicle that is closing in on you from behind. You measure a space between you and the closing in of the vehicle because you measure the distance between you and the vehicle that chases you with your auditory faculty. We can see only what is in front of us. We cannot see what is behind us. We can only hear what is behind us. We can only smell what is behind us. And that is why Andrew Marvell, in an apparently simple poem to his coy mistress, says, "At my back from time to time, I can hear time swing the chariot drawing near, but yonder before us all lie vast deserts of eternity." What is in front of us, I can see, the poet says. What is it? Vast deserts of eternity. But what is behind him, can you see? Can he see? No. He says, I can see what is behind me only through my auditory faculty. At my back from time to time, I can hear time swing the chariot drawing near. He applies his auditory faculty to measure distance behind and applies his visual faculty to measure space in front. So human experience is a total experience, whereas from Renaissance onwards, with the invention of perspective onwards, it has been reduced to a visual faculty. So I would say we are all at a disadvantage when compared to a blind man. Regarding perception, the seminality, the concreteness of perception. That's all. I can only say that. Nobody can answer.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah, I have so many more questions, but maybe I'll save it for another day when we meet again. Thank you so much.
Any other question or interaction? Any other?
I think there are a few questions in the chat. There's a chat box.
What are the questions?
There's a question about the post-impressionistic movement. Could you say something about the post-impressionistic movement as well?
Yeah. I deliberately avoided post-impressionism due to lack of time. When you think of Vincent van Gogh, for example, when you think of Cézanne, the paintings of Van Gogh, the paintings of Cézanne, they are all called the post-impressionists. But especially Vincent van Gogh, I wanted to show you Vincent van Gogh. Due to time, I did not show you that. What characterizes Van Gogh is Van Gogh, his life. He was actually haunted by insanity, and he committed suicide, shot himself. Never in his lifetime he sold a single painting, and his whole life was a series of tragedies, ending in that kind of suicide. But he was a self-taught painter, and his models were all impressionist painters, like Renoir, all these things, Sisley, then Monet, Manet, and others. But he began as an impressionist, using impressionist technique, rich, tactile texturing, then nuances or shades he used. But because of his particular psychic condition, because of its trauma, psychological trauma, he began to articulate that subjective reality, and his main concern was to somehow exorcise the demon in his unconscious. And all his landscapes, if you watch his painting, if you see his paintings like Sunflower or Night Scene and all these things, any painting, the actual object or actual subject is only a peg to hang his psychological oppression or oppressive feeling, trauma into the foreground. So with Van Gogh, what we find is the style continues, the impressionist style continues, but there is a shift in subject matter. There is a kind of growing subjectivity in subject matter, which later became an expressionist concern. So what we call post-impressionist functions as a bridge between impressionist movement and expressionist movement that came after that. In between, a twilight period characterizes post-impressionism. Technique is impressionistic, but in subject matter, they are coming closer and closer to all the concerns of expressionist painting. For example, oppression, suppression, insanity, incompatibility, all these things actually constituted the harrowing experience of the painter like Vincent van Gogh. So I think post-impressionism functions by the very prefix post. It functions as a bridge between impressionism. Technique is impressionist, but then subject matter growingly become more and more expressionist. It anticipates another movement, expressions. Okay.
So, yes, sir. There is another question,
Another question.
by
Somebody asked.
Malavika.
Yeah.
Visual narrative. Yeah, visual narrative is taking new leaps in new media. Is it indicating to the death of written articulation of art? What are the potential danger in this? As literature students, practitioners, we stick to writing or go with the flow?
Once more, can you repeat it?
Visual narrative. Yes, sir. Visual narrative is taking new leaps in new media. Is it indicating to the death of written articulation of art? What are the potential danger in this? As literature students and practitioners, we stick to writing or go with the flow?
No, as you said, as I said earlier, of course, our contemporary culture has become predominantly visual. We are surrounded by visuals. We are flooded with visuals. At the same time, these visuals, conceived as visuals, they are inarticulate. And our attempt, knowingly or unknowingly, is to articulate the feelings these visuals, visuals arouse in us. So any kind of visual has its corresponding response or reciprocation from the viewer, and the viewer reciprocates to that in terms of verbal language only. Whether you articulate in writing or not, you can reciprocate to a visual only in verbal language. You conceive of an object in terms of words. You can't think without words. And the interesting thing is that you can't think without images. So there is a moment where images and words coalesce, and we are oppressed with visuals now. And the problem is, you are at a particular crossroads of culture or cultural perception where we might find a different language altogether. And the new media language, the kind of language that develops from the new media is entirely different from the kind of preceding languages. For example, in the reading of a novel or in the writing of a novel, there is a growing tendency to make the experience simultaneous. Now, the simultaneity of reading has become a very day-to-day reality today because of our browsing experience. Now, the challenge on the part of the writer, a novelist, or a visual artist is to how to address this browsing sensibility or browsing tendency of the reader. Can a reading be simultaneous? Reading is, of course, simultaneous, but can a writer write a linear narrative, verbal narrative in this simultaneous manner? We have postmodern writings. I told you about Rob Gilley and others. Then if you read Life a User's Manual by George Perec, if you read contemporary novels, if you read Italo Calvino, there is a simultaneity in reading that. We call it a kind of metafictional writing, and writing is tending more and more towards metafictionality and metafictional quality. One main aspect of metafictional quality is this kind of simultaneity. And of course, it throws new challenges to budding writers, aspiring writers like you. And not that you have to give up or the world will give up. No, nothing can spell the death of language. It will survive. It has survived, it will survive. But of course, new paradigms have to be found, and new standards have to be set, and new styles have to be evolved. I quote a line from T.S. Eliot. The last year's language serves only last year's humanity, and a new language awaits new humanity. We have had our day and make us obsolete. You can make writers obsolete. You can make classical writers obsolete by formatting your own language. And you will find new language. Even the very format of this seminar, we belonging to the obsolete generation, we find so clipped and handicapped, not able to see you, deprived of physical contact with you. But today's students are at home. So at home, because you grow up in this, and it evolved a new idea of communal sharing. It evolved a new idea of communication. But the very idea of communication theory has to change, and it will take place. I'm very optimistic about that, and be optimistic about this too. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. Bluebirds fly. Let us have this hope. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds will fly, and the world will become entirely surrealistic, entirely fantastic, entirely hallucinatory, and that kind of cosmic madness awaits us, which is very enlightening, if I may say so. I don't know whether I answered her question properly, but that's what all I can say.
John sir, I think your microphone is muted.
Pardon?
Jayaram sir, I hope there aren't any more questions. We would like to go on, but then we are a little bit late today.
Okay.
It's 8:45,
Okay.
and
Right.
I believe that you have opened a new vision, a new site for the participants. I hope my students will be able to look at their literary studies from a different perspective in the light of the art and paintings. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much on behalf of the department, as well as on behalf of all the participants. And I also thank each one of the participants, and we will join together tomorrow here at the same time at 7 o'clock on this platform. We have Professor Janaki Sridharan from Calicut University tomorrow. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Chance for me. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
ജോൺസൺ സാറേ,
എന്തോ
പ്രശാന്തത്തിന് ഇപ്പൊ കയറുമായിരുന്നു. പ്രശാന്ത്
അത് ശരി.
ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നേ,
അച്ഛന്റെ മൈക്ക് മ്യൂട്ടാ.